Hello and welcome to the Keep Learning podcast. My name is Alicia Siska.
And I'm Matthew Mesley.
And today the episode is slightly different to what we have done before. Since this is our last episode in this first series in the academic year 2020-2021, we thought we would finish with something that might give you some food for thought for the summer. And this is going to be a conversation about a book, which is
Should I bring it on?
Study skills. Yes.
Dun, da, da. So this is the book that we're looking at today.
Indeed. So this is the Study Skills Handbook by Stella Cottrell, and we chose this one because it's a bit of a classic in terms of the offer on the market for study skills books, because study skills books are quite new, right?
Yeah, I mean, this might have just been the kind of student I was, but I don't think there were that many study skills books when I was a student, or we weren't necessarily directed or signposted to them as much. I don't know if that's your experience as well.
So that's my experience during my undergraduate study. But when I progressed to postgraduate, more specifically to studying for PhD, and because I was studying in America, where we actually took classes and were proper students, right, rather than just doing our own research, as is more kind of common in the UK, it was very important to our lecturers for us to develop good learning habits, and also, more importantly even than that, I think they kind of relied on us knowing that already, but knowing how to write well. That was essential, obviously, to being a successful PhD student. And so what we worked with was Strunk and White. Do you know Strunk and White? No. Elements of Style. It's like an absolute classic. It was first released in the 1930s. So these books do go back quite a while. And I love this book. It's my absolute favorite when it comes to books about writing. It's tiny. I was looking for it, but I think I left it in my office before it shut down. So I haven't got it at home, but it's a tiny little book, very thin, but it has everything you need to know about writing.
Oh, wow. I wonder whether that's something to do with the American culture as well of learning, whether, I don't know, when I this is not supposed to be a criticism of British academics, but I wonder whether there is that more of that sort of expectation that you'll just learn as you go along and that you'll just pick up these skills. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, writing instruction is very much embedded in the educational journey of any American student, right? I mean, composition 101, everyone knows what it is and everyone had to take it. So writing, I think culturally is also just part of the culture itself. So writing is very important to Americans. They do it a lot. And I think that attitude is slightly different. It's more practiced rather than just expected, maybe. Mm-hmm.
But I wonder now if the lecturers coming up who may have had this experience as they were undergraduates using these kinds of books will now put more of an emphasis on that for their students, or maybe signpost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because I think I actually don't know exactly when we started recommending these books, but it's probably no longer than maybe a decade or two when they became quite the norm, let's say, in academia, in UK academia, right? And even still, I suppose, I know in some programs, students are only directed to these books once they reach the third year, when they write their dissertation, and it becomes so new then that they are then kind of advised to read specialist books on how to write a dissertation. So it's still not necessarily the norm to recommend.
I mean, I've taught in the first number of first year groups, and I have a feeling that sometimes this is almost sort of, I don't know, put out there in the induction, and then that's it kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think it's often just kind of mentioned as something that will help you. But if sometimes students come to university, who are advanced and who have a lot of confidence in their skills, and they might feel like they don't need this kind of book, because the very phrase study skills in some people kind of evokes this image of, you need help.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be so. And in fact, I think this book that we're talking about today is so much more than that.
Yeah. And I think actually, what I liked actually about this book really connected to that point, because it does actually mention how it's not just for people that might struggle with studying. It could be for people who already think they're good studiers, or get the higher marks, but this could be something that pushes that even further or helps them develop it. Or if they are somebody that really struggles with it, it can give them the tools to start studying effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the strength of the book is that it really is written for everyone, that someone who doesn't have the confidence and needs very detailed instructions will find lots of it here. And also someone who is advanced will still learn something, because I still learn something from this book, even though, so yeah, well, but we always learn. We keep learning throughout life.
So yeah, what were your initial impressions, or do you want me to give you my initial impressions?
Yeah, give me yours.
I thought overall I was really impressed. I thought it looked at a number of areas that wouldn't normally be thought of as a study skills book. So it talked about cultural expectations, for instance, if you're an international student, thinking, but also talked about managing stress and anxiety. But fundamentally, I suppose, I really liked how it emphasized it emphasized that you wanted to, or that you should try and be more self-aware about yourself as a learner. Does that make sense? That seemed to be like one of the central themes that
I'm glad you're talking about this, because this was actually my favorite chapter.
Okay.
The chapter, so it's chapter 4. It's called Successful Study. And it basically, the whole premise of this chapter is to develop that self-awareness in terms of who you are as a student and how you learn, and what underpins your understanding of the learning process as well. So you have these 10 different views on intelligence. That's brilliant. And this is something even advanced students would find probably interesting and new. How you can perceive your ability in so many different ways, and you don't have to. I think lots of students, or not just students, but lots of us kind of subscribe to this very traditional way that intelligence is static. You just have it or you don't have it. And so I end up hearing students telling me, oh, I don't think I'm capable of this, or they receive a very good grade and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I didn't think I could do that, but now I'm thinking maybe I would be able to progress in this direction or that direction. So all of a sudden that grade becomes that validation that opens up possibilities. But actually, if they knew that there are so many different ways in which we can approach intelligence and our own ability, that would be already very liberating, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I really like that sort of chapter as well, and I think it sort of extended some of the earlier conversations where it was about, so what kind of, like, what, how do you study, and what do you like to do, or what do you think you need to work on more to develop your study practices. So it was very much about identifying like who you were and being aware of what kind of learner you were, I suppose. But I also liked that it was very inclusive in terms of that it's kind of like making a sort of showing you that actually a lot of the time work that you do at university, it's about following a formula. It's not about intelligence, is it? It's if you can if you can work out how to write a particular way, sometimes that's that's how you can sort of crack the code, can't you?
Yeah,
so
indeed. And in fact, I think that's also the strength of the book, that it gives you that space for self-reflection, right? There's constantly that question, okay, now you know all of this, turn it back on yourself and see how do you do this, or verifying maybe your beliefs about how you approach a certain topic, area of study, etc. So I think that reflective element is the strength of the book as well.
Yeah, I liked that. I suppose that was also linked to one of their goals, wasn't it? Which was to make sure that there's a sort of active process throughout the handbook, that you're not just reading information after information, that you're able to like stop and I don't know, tick off a few boxes that are pertinent to you, or reflect on something, or answer a few questions, or things like that. And I thought that was quite useful.
Yes, and that links to another element of this book to me, which is, it's not the kind of book that you would read from cover to cover, right? I mean, I haven't read it, the whole thing. I mean, it's a very long book. I mean, you can't see it if you look at this, but so in terms of pages, it's over 400 pages, very heavy, right? Because these pages, it's a very good quality in terms of the print and the general kind of publication of it. So it's a heavy, big book, and you're not supposed to read it as a whole, but kind of dip in and out of the areas that you are interested in or want to explore in more depth, right? So you have, how many chapters do we have here? It's 18 chapters. Yeah, because just to say, this is the latest edition. Yeah, that's 2019 that we have, because this book has been so popular that it has gone through multiple editions.
It would be fascinating to see how it's changed from the first edition.
I know that the previous edition, I think, was 15 chapters.
Oh,
so
wow.
Now we have 3 extra chapters. And, I'm sure after COVID, we'll have even more, because everything will have changed. This is just on the eve of that transformation.
Yeah, you can imagine there might be sort of chapters on breakout rooms and Zoom and things like that.
Yes, and I hope so. I hope it will. But yeah, I mean, 15 chapters, so you can actually just target whatever you want to target, and not only that, but it's very visually presented, right? So you have all these cartoons and a little bit of humor injected here, and drawings and graphs and tables and all sorts of
student experiences, or like of their reflections. I like that too.
And on top of that, there is this extension into the online materials and exercises, right? So you can actually download some of the sheets and do it on, and save it for your records, so you don't actually have to do it in the book, or you can share it, or you can do.
I wonder if in an initial edition there was a CD-ROM that you could use.
That'll be interesting to see it.
But, yeah, I definitely liked that you were able to the visual experience of the book, and also, as you said, that's what I also liked about how it was very upfront about how that you shouldn't necessarily read this all in one go, that you could dip in and out of it, and it gave you suggestions for how, like at the beginning, for how you might want to sort of tackle it. But also, if you weren't sure, it gave you sort of some exercises that you could do to think about what you might need to look at, or what you would want to focus on. So I thought that was useful too.
Yeah. And generally, it kind of follows that the mission that we have. The idea is to kind of demystify all these baffling concepts, such as critical reflection or analytical writing. When a student receives feedback along these lines, there's not enough analysis, and they're not quite sure what it means, they'll find these answers in the book.
So what was your favorite chapter then, or is that what?
So it was this one on a successful study. But you haven't told me yours.
My favorite chapter was probably the managing stress and well-being section. I have, because you know that I've made some videos on that, so I was particularly interested in seeing what was there, I suppose. And I think it's great, first of all, that it's just being acknowledged that this is something that's important. In terms of study skills, because I wonder whether this was something that was mentioned in the first edition, but it would be interesting to know. And I like the idea about recognizing that anxiety or stress is a normal part of your sort of student life, but also how you can confront or manage them as well. I thought there were some really good tips there. I also really like the attention to like milestones in this chapter. So there was like what you can try and do in the first few weeks, or what you can do in the first year, and recognizing that every time you're doing something new and you get past that, that's actually an achievement worth celebrating. And I liked that kind of thing, because I think sometimes as students we can be like, oh no, I've got this to do, and we forget I did this, I did that kind of aspect. Does that make sense?
It does, because I was planning to end on this note, but why not say it now? To me, generally, the book was very encouraging. So everything it does with the purpose of reinforcing the already existing strengths that students bring to the study. So it's not assuming you're coming as a blank slate to be filled by us here. No, it's kind of showing you already know things. So let's just review what you know and see whether it works or not. And if it doesn't, maybe we could rethink that, and this is what we propose, right? But it's constantly encouraging in terms of what's possible and what you're capable of as a learner.
I like that. So it's sort of like expecting that you can. It's sort of like almost saying you can do this. You know, don't worry. It's giving you like a sort of pat on the back. And saying,
don't we all need it?
Definitely.
But there are some kicks as well. It definitely puts you to work, right? It's not just telling you how wonderful you are, but it's telling you actually, you need to work on this or that. And it does require some commitment in order to bring the results that you want.
And I suppose even that commitment to think about some of these things as well. And sometimes that can be hard as a student, I think, just giving yourself time to be like, right, maybe I should sit down and just reflect on that. Sometimes as a student, you're not necessarily in that frame or mood. So, I mean, like, how would you, maybe we can talk about that later in terms of how, like, in terms of what you would recommend, how you would recommend using this, but I do think the idea of sort of dipping into it might help then, so that you're not like overwhelmed. You don't have to do like a huge amount all the time. It's just that you might want to focus on one or two things, so.
Exactly. And you don't, because sometimes there is this kind of, because I know when I read books, I like to read them from cover to cover. and sometimes, and it's a mistake, because you sometimes do need just one chapter and that will change your life, or you do need just one section and that will contribute something very, very important, without you spending all this time navigating and maybe getting discouraged by, this is not relevant to me, or at this point in time, this is not helpful, but something else could be, because everything is relevant. But, we all kind of grow as learners, and we find ourselves at different stages of the learning process, and something that we can read something and we're not ready to absorb it yet, right? So our engagement with it will be maybe superficial, or just not what it could be if we were ready to read it. So I think making decisions as to which parts to read and which to leave for later, I think is also quite critical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, she even says to like maybe skim through it first,
Yeah.
thinking about what might be something that you want to focus on more. But also I can like what you just talked about. I can imagine this kind of book, you might need to go back to a chapter a couple times, or a particular section to because there will be times in your year where something just becomes more obvious or apparent than earlier on. So
exactly. And it's a little bit like an encyclopedia, right? You don't just read it and commit to memory, but you constantly you treat it like as a reference book rather than a learning knowledge-based book.
So do you have a question? Or
I was going to ask you if you had a favorite tip from the book.
Yeah, well, it was kind of like my favorite statement, maybe because it made me think of my time as a student back in the days. But there was like a comment that she made, I think in one of the earlier chapters, which was, there is little value in being present in body but absent in mind during class. And I thought that was a really useful comment in terms of, we've all been there where we've dragged ourselves to a lecture and then we've literally not listened to anything or engaged with anything in the lecture. So I thought it was quite helpful in thinking about that you need to sometimes get yourself in the right space for a lecture. That it's not just about being there, it's also about preparing for a lecture or a seminar, and that can include both your body and mind. So having some coffee, having a shower to wake yourself up, being in that mode where you're like, I'm able to receive information and understand it. So
this is brilliant. Yeah, and I think in particular now with online learning, where we can just log on, turn off our camera, turn off our mic, and disengage. This is particularly crucial because being present and just kind of allowing yourself to be there for that session, and decide, okay, the next hour is for this. I'm not looking at my email, I'm not looking at my phone, I'm not doing all these things that yes I need to get done, but actually by multitasking we're not in either place. And in the end both things may be done but they're not fully experienced, and not being in the space. I love this because this is almost like the primary tenet of mindfulness, isn't it? It's just be there when you are there and not be in two places at once.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like, I think that it's really it does have a lot of value in terms of online spaces as well, because I know I mean, I don't mind if students don't have their camera on, but for me personally, when I've done it myself, when I've put the camera on and I'm in a meeting, I know that I'm concentrating harder. Like if I switch off the video, then I know that I can sort of look at other things or that I'm, looking at my emails while, because you know that you don't have to be on to some extent, and that isn't all about, you can still be off camera and be concentrating, but you can sometimes almost it's about a way of being and about maybe being tempted. I don't know, does it make sense? I don't know if I'm making sense.
It does, because a lot depends on your own discipline, self-discipline, right? Because if you can't turn it off, turn your mic off and your camera off and still be present, fabulous. But it's just too tempting to do other things. It's just, you mentioned meetings, we go to meetings, workshops, all sorts of sessions, CPD, etc. And I find myself as well, when I turn it off, I will look at my email and I will respond. And I think I'm listening, but then all of a sudden I lost the conversation and I can't even, identify the moment when I lost it because I thought I was paying attention, but it's impossible. And for me, actually, in order to be present, I have to switch on my camera, because then I feel like I'm properly part of that group.
Yeah.
But that's an individual.
Yeah, definitely. But I think I like that link to online, about how you might need to be ready for the online space as well. But I suppose also I thought that point was more broadly about some of her comments about flipped learning, which which basically means that as a student, you want to be prepared a little bit for a lecture, and particularly a seminar, I would say. So, that you've done the reading, that you're aware of what the seminar's about, and maybe even have thought about some of the questions that you want to talk about.
Yeah.
So I thought I liked that whole sort of like getting yourself ready, but also the idea that the bit before your lecture and seminar and how you approach your lecture and seminar is just as important sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
So how about you? What was your favorite?
I didn't choose something as inspirational as you did. I chose something actually that is kind of out of character for me, because I don't really like recipes and acronyms and stuff like that, and yet that's exactly what I chose. So,
okay.
So on page 78, she introduces the concept of individual learning shapes.
Ooh.
And SHAPES is an acronym that stands for skills, habits, attitudes, preferences, experiences, and strategies. And to me, it's like self-MOT in terms of who you are as a learner. And to be honest, I wish I had done something like this before I started on this kind of HE journey when I was younger, because it would have allowed me to take stock of everything that I bring into that study to understand myself in that process, because I think we're never taught, I was not taught to think this way. And so I thought this was a very useful exercise for any student to do, even before they start university, but even if they don't do it before, at any stage, really. Because even for me now to do it was like, that's interesting. It's kind of a self-assessment of where you are and what you can do with it.
Yeah, I like it because as well, it's very much looking at your learning in the round as well.
Yeah.
And there's another word for it that is better, but I can't think of it at the moment. But thinking about that, I like how it's about your it's sort of talking about attitudes, talking about preferences, experiences. It's not just you're sitting down to write kind of aspect. So I like that.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that I also liked was that she constantly emphasizes the idea that learning is a process, just like writing is a process. So there's never one way to do it, but also there's never almost a moment when you reach complete mastery. You're always somewhere on that journey of growth, in terms of who you are as a learner, and as a writer. And I think, I often emphasize it to my students as well. You're always in this process, and accepting that, I think, makes things easier or less easier, and not in the sense of doing them, but of thinking about them. The attitude is just a little bit less intimidating.
There's less pressure, isn't there?
Yeah,
I think so. I like that too. So was there anything that you didn't like so much?
Yeah, a few small things, really. One is very specific.
Okay.
So, page 243.
Oh my God, it's really a bit specific.
Very specific. So there's this discussion here about using Wikipedia. And And, I do agree with everything that is written here, that obviously, lecturers don't like students to use Wikipedia, and for a good reason. And this should always be just for kind of background reading, maybe if necessary, or something that you just want to quickly look up. That's the purpose of Wikipedia. And Jimmy Wales, who launched Wikipedia, also told students, for God's sakes, do not use any encyclopedias in your writing. You're in college, you need to use more scholarly sources. But she says there, look up and read its references. So if you look up, you read something on Wikipedia, don't use it. But then she says, refer to these references rather than to Wikipedia in your work. And I'm like, no, don't say that, because I've seen that in action as well. A student actually, that they're using Wikipedia, but they're bringing the reference that they read in the Wikipedia. So actually, they never read the source, which is referenced. And that's a massive no-no to me. And I mean, I know that this is probably just because she does say look up and read its references. So it does mention look them up, but it doesn't say very explicitly you should not just steal someone's references and use them as your own.
The problem is if you do that shortcut, isn't it?
Yes.
If you're just but also it's really obvious to your lecturers when you've done that, because you'll probably only really be highlighting a rather generalized picture from the Wikipedia article rather than the more in-depth discussion or analysis in the reference book. So it will just not look like
and
helpful
also
anyway.
It's often taken out of its context, for the purposes of that Wikipedia article. And actually, when you look it up and follow that source, you will see that actually they're talking about something different, but that particular fragment worked for the Wikipedia article, but doesn't necessarily work for your own. And therefore, it's inappropriate. But also, your lecturer will know that you did not access it because maybe it's not possible to access that source because it's behind a paywall maybe, or it's a book that is quite old or is not available, in the library, etc., etc. So it's like almost encouraging a student to fall into that trap, of.
I almost kind of suggest that they shouldn't be referencing anything unless they've read it.
Exactly.
Whenever I hear, like, if a student comes up to me and says, how do we cite something that's cited in someone else's book? Then I'm like, well, what is the purpose of that you citing it if you haven't read it? So I think that you have to be careful.
And even if you do that, you would say that this was cited. The original source is this, but actually it was cited in this source. And so if you were to do it, because that's academic integrity, that tells you to do so this way. So in fact, you would have to say this source as cited in Wikipedia, and therefore you're actually working with Wikipedia.
But I suppose often if you're thinking of it like, oh, this is citing this, and I need to cite this this reference, then you're kind of thinking of the information purely in terms of like what it's saying, but not how that author is using that work, or how it's like adding to their argument, or whether they expand on it, or does that make sense? So
completely, it's completely decontextualized. So
I think you have to be really careful with that. So,
and if we are on this point of Wikipedia, it's not just that, and the fact that occasionally maybe information is not verified or there's something wrong with the way the article was written, but also, I know when a student used Wikipedia, because if I have 5 essays on the same topic and they follow the same structure, I know that this structure came from somewhere, and it's usually Wikipedia. And it's so that is also important, that it's not just what these sources use as sources, but also how they bring them together into a particular argument. And you can be so easily swayed by someone's structure and logic and just follow that structure and logic in your own essay, and then all of a sudden I'm reading 5 very similar essays and becoming a little bit suspicious about this.
Well, the problem is with Wikipedia is that it's often very timeline focused. So it will be like the first Punic War, the second Punic War, like that kind of thing. And if you're the essays just resemble a timeline, it's not it will just emphasize description rather than analysis, won't it? So that I totally feel you there.
So that was just one.
We talked about that quite a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, but the other ones, I think maybe a few. Well, one thing I suppose for me, because I come from the humanities and work with students in arts and humanities, a lot of examples in the book and writing samples are from science. And so I think that some students in arts and humanities would find it less appealing or applicable to their own study. So, but obviously, a book author like that is trying to address every student. And that could be a weakness, because it's not specific enough. And there are lots of study skills books specifically for disciplines. So I even have here on my shelf one for anthropology students, one for art history students, one for history students, etc. So these more specific books can be more effective in that regard. So that kind of generic nature of the book is its weakness to an extent.
That need to almost be all-encompassing and comprehensive.
Yes.
That kind of links to my point as well, which is really petty as well. But I suppose it's just that I felt some of the writing sections were almost cluttered. Like really, there was almost like too much information in that, in a sense. And I wondered whether it would have been clearer if it was pared down a little bit in some of the sections. But at the same time, I think it was full of really useful information. So there wasn't anything that I was like, oh, this isn't useful or worthwhile. But I think it's almost when you have a kind of study skills book, when writing is only one element of this whole, but there's so much that you can say about writing. I mean, I think it's great what she's been able to do, but there's just so it almost becomes quite like I'm going to try and point to every sort of possibility that you could think about, and I wonder whether you could get slightly overwhelmed with it.
I agree. I mean, one way of kind of mollifying this is the fact that the index is really extensive, right? So you can actually find a very specific aspect of writing in the index and then follow to that page instead of reading the whole section. So it kind of goes back again to that point that neither the book itself nor a chapter maybe should be read in one go, because it's
I think that is even more the case when it comes to the writing sections. I think that you maybe take one aspect if you were to look at paragraphing, or one aspect in terms of planning, and then you could sort of dip into that and dip out of it. But there's just almost too much to look at a whole chapter in one go. So
and not every student needs all of it, right? No. Because they may be great at structuring paragraphs, but they may be less good at maybe integrating quotations into their writing, and actually they should focus on this section instead of that section. So again, it's a little bit like it's a fruitcake, with lots of raisins and nuts in it, and you just have to pick the ones that you like and are interested in.
And I'd also probably linked to the writing section some of the examples used. I don't know if you got a chance to look at them, but there was, for instance, one on Mary Seacole, the famous nurse, and it was in a section on paragraphing, and I think again this is about trying to be everything for all people. I think it was because they wanted to show you how you could write paragraphs on particular aspects of her life, but the actual example did not resemble in any way, shape, or form what a history essay would be asking of a student. For instance, you wouldn't be doing a set biography probably of Mary Seacole. There would be like a question, and there would be like references that you would have to include. So I think that I would say maybe use the examples with a bit of care in terms of the writing section. These are sort of generic examples. They're not necessarily what your writing should end up looking like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, I think it would have been very, very difficult to write a book that addresses everyone's needs. Yeah. And this one doesn't. I mean, in terms of its weaknesses, that's its weakness, but also a strength, right? Because it's for everyone, but it's not specialized for anyone at the same time. Yeah, so it's kind of both. And also when it comes to overwhelming, while, all these images and cartoons and graphs and arrows and bullet points, etc. All of it is great for a lot of students. I think some students could find it visually overwhelming as well. Yeah. There's like just a lot going on any page. So I think that's also, it's not for everyone. And I'm old-fashioned, so I prefer plain text. So it's not quite for me. But then, students who really like being engaged visually, they will love it. So
and it might be something that you just need to get your eye in. Does that make sense? Like, I think like you, I found some of the pages a bit busy, but that when you sort of in my first initial was like, so much things happening, but then if you took them in sections, then it became easier. Does that make sense? So,
and if they didn't do it this way, I imagine this book could be like 1,000-page long.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it was a really clever way of getting as much information into it as possible. So
so I do wonder now, in this case, what is the object that you have that speaks to this book?
Okay, well, I don't know if it will now, but or not necessarily to what we've been saying just earlier, but the thing that I had that I've brought on the objective week is goggles. Ooh. Okay, now you might think at first that this is like, it's just a sort of like, I'm saying that that you can prepare for study like you can prepare for swimming with goggles, but it's a bit more than that. So basically, when I haven't been swimming for ages, but when I started a couple years back, going back into swimming, I swam without goggles. And I don't know how much you know about swimming, but swimming, like doing front crawl, doing breaststroke and any sort of stroke without goggles, you have to sort of breathe in a different way than if you use goggles, because you're not necessarily, for instance, with breaststroke, you're not necessarily going under the water. And I thought this was kind of like how you can sometimes build up sort of ways of approaching studying, and they're not necessarily the best, but you can sort of get along with them, and they still work. But that, I think, with just like with your goggles, if you can sort of get to that next level, it will take a bit of time though to sometimes to sort of get back into the different kind of breathing routine or rhythm. So and that's what it did with me. It got me into it took a bit of time, but then once you do, it's a lot better. So that's what I thought. So that's what I was thinking of when I picked this.
I love this. I would never have thought about goggles having that function, and how metaphorically rich.
Because it really changed how you swim and how you then breathe in the water. So So yeah, I suppose it's just a way of thinking that with the kind of skills that you pick up, don't perhaps worry if it takes a bit of time to get into a new routine or a new way of doing something, because it's going to take that bit of time. Does that make sense? So
yeah, it does. It does.
So yeah,
it will stay with me, this metaphor. So thank
it's
you.
Probably completely wrong on a number of levels, but
no. And it cannot possibly be wrong. There's no such thing as right and wrong.
But it's not just so it's not just about, oh, it can help you see better. It's a bit more than that. So I suppose moving on then, would you recommend this book to your students?
You know what? Yes, I would. I think that this book, as I mentioned before, has something for everyone. I think that, some of the simple advice that maybe would be unnecessary for advanced students is really nicely mixed with more complex and sometimes theoretical sections, like the one I mentioned before on the 10 different views on intelligence, which to me, it's very precious to explore. And it's both for new students and new as in, high school leavers and mature students. It's very encouraging. And it also recommends using podcasts for learning.
Yay!
How about you?
I agree. I think it's something that I would definitely recommend to students, and I would recommend that they use it. Don't just maybe use it in the first year, because I think this is the kind of book that you could go back to in year 5 and year 6 and think about other sections or other areas to improve upon. And one of the things that I liked about the book as a whole was that it also was getting you to think about your future and how the skills that you're picking up now will also be applicable in a work context or a later context. So I liked that it was looking forward, not just sort of looking at what you're doing at the moment. So.
And there's a whole section on employability as well, right? And even thinking about interviews and how to present yourself in the workplace, etc. So it's very broad in its reach. But we would still say, but bear in mind, it is quite generic. It has all these potential I don't know if weaknesses, but something to be aware of. So I would say not to dismiss the book based on what it doesn't do, but look at what it does do and to what extent it can be really helpful on your journey as a student and prepare you for that journey, right? Because, we're recommending it as a summer read because it could be helpful if you're coming to university and not quite sure what to expect. But also if you've just passed a year, first or second year, and you're thinking, I could actually upgrade my study skills a bit and maybe consider looking at this book.
Yeah, and I mean, because I think it's all about the great thing about it, with caveats obviously, but the great thing about it is that it's emphasizing that you're in control of your learning, and I think and that you need to sometimes step back and just be a little bit more self-aware about it. And I think that's quite a nice message that it kind of pushes this the self-awareness and of yourself as a student and what your skills and strengths are and what you could develop.
Precisely. So in a way, it's kind of asking you to think about whether you're sure you know how to study and maybe rethink it and reconsider. Because we sometimes get kind of really wedded to a particular way of doing things and believing that this is the best way of doing things. But actually, after learning that there are other ways and perhaps better ways, it can make a difference.
We can sometimes get so stressed about what we're doing that we forget about how we're doing it, I suppose.
And so being open to that rethinking, I think, is is important here, and maybe something we can leave our listeners and our everyone who's watching us with as a kind of last thought.
Yeah, I like that, being willing to sort of to know that you can change it up or experiment with your learning. So
excellent. Yeah, amazing. So what remains is probably to wish everyone a wonderful summer, and if you watch us on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe to the podcast. If you watch us through the university platform, there's an option to contact us with ideas for podcasts that would be useful to you. So
yes, that's a new addition, isn't it?
Our new addition, new function. So please use it, because next year, well, as in September, we're going to start a new series on writing, and but we're very open to all other ideas coming from you.
Yeah, so we look forward to seeing you again in September. We're going to have a bit of a summer break.
Yeah.
And we hope that you also relax and recharge over the summer. But in the meantime, and also keep remembering to keep learning.
Indeed. Thank you for watching. Until September. Bye-bye.